Consequences of War is really an interesting piece given Rubens' background. Now, Rubens' diplomatic missions gave him a unique perspective on European politics, and he never ceased pushing for peace, even though at the time Europe is constantly at war. As we look at the piece, the fluid motion of the forms and the energy of the chaotic scene are reminiscent of his overall style. So let's start walking around the piece. What we see here is Mars having opened the door to the Roman temple of Jupiter, which you see there. These doors are closed during times of peace, and they're open at times of war, hence the symbolism. And Mars is rushing headlong into the world. Venus and Cupid are trying to hold him back to no avail. Of course, love and fertility are things that are generally lost in times of war. It's not exactly, the top priority at the time. From the other side, the Fury by the name of Aleko is dragging him forward, torch in hand. Of course, he represents chaos, and chaos is really reminiscent of war itself. In times of war, there is nothing but chaos throughout the land. No one has a plan. It's sort of like the COVID pandemic, where during the initial shutdown, no one really knows what's going on. No one's sure of what's going to happen, and consequently, you have some element of chaos, or at least selling out of toilet paper. Nearby, we will see pestilence and famine. Pestilence with that odd-looking orb, the child with the orb, and famine, the child who's falling backwards. Because, of course, in the wake of war, you tend to have starvation and you tend to have disease because any form of hygiene is going to fall apart. On the ground, we see a woman with a broken lute. This is harmony, the loss of music. Of course, there can be no music, no arts during a time of war. And the man, who you see right here, is holding a compass. This is symbolic of the loss of, intellectual pursuits in times of war. Again, something that is left to the side. The woman with child, the loss of domesticity during times of war. So there's a great deal going on. We see Mars stepping on a book. Again, intellectual pursuits. We see Cupid having dropped his arrows, the loss of love during times of war. So what Rubens is doing overall is trying to give us a specific message. You could read it as war messes everything up, but really it goes deeper. War has an impact on everything, especially if you happen to be in the path of the war. So don't go to it. He's trying to remind people who can very easily be incensed into believing that they need to go to war for whatever reason. He's trying to remind them of the hardships that go along with it, because it's so easy to forget that. Let me remind you that World War I ends in 1918. And by the time we get to 1939, barely 21 years later, Germany is again at war, having forgotten the lessons of World War I and the brutality that went along with it. And this happens all the time. So that makes this a really powerful piece, reminding people of the horrors of war without using the gory detail that we'll see from other movements later on, such as German New Objectivity.